Welcome back, everybody. I got Dr. Stephen Baskerville with me again. You guys might remember him from my last discussion in which we discussed his new book. Today, we're going to have a different discussion, which is about child support in the administration of children and families. So we got a department of Health and Human Services, and within that are a couple offices. One of them's in administration of children and families. And then there's another office there, which is, I believe, under ACF. That is OCSS. That's the Office of Child Support Services, formerly known as OCSE. I think the woke folks got there and thought enforcement sounded really bad, so they changed enforcement to services recently. But with RFK Jr., being appointed head of HHS, Health and Human Services, it's looking like there's going to be more appointments down the line. ACF is one of them. OCSS is another. So we figured we'd do a video and discuss those appointments, and more so those offices and the impacts that they have on American families. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen Baskerville, if you want to say a few words, maybe introduce yourself further.
Thank you, Shaw. It's good to be here with you again. Yeah, I've been working in these issues for about 25 years, families, child support, divorce, custody, all these things. I'd never planned it. I was studying other things, history, political science, but I got, I had my plans and God had his. So I got involved in this stuff. And since then, I found it tremendously important. So I keep at it. And I'm very glad to meet Shaw. When I started doing this kind of work 25 years ago, there were many people, a lot of fathers very active in these, family fathers' rights groups, and they were a lot of them were very knowledgeable. They knew the system inside out, and I don't find this today at all. I find there's an awful lot of ranting and raving against the feminists and against the unfairness of the child custody system. Understandably, I don't fault anybody for that. But the people that really know the system are few and far between. So I was very pleased to stumble upon your work, Shaw, your interview with Pearl Davis and your analysis of one of my videos, I guess. And so, I think you're a rare resource, and I'm very grateful to you for going in on this with me and and teaming up.
I appreciate that. I'll tell you, I'm a little similar to you in that I didn't really plan on going, into child support, or I didn't really think about it too much. It kind of happened almost by accident, as a kind of fluke, and I happened to see this position that was available, and I applied for it, and I even forgot that I applied for it, and then 7 months later they reached back out to me, and I really had very little idea of what it was, but then I learned what the entire system was, and I was like, wow, nobody really knows about this. And in fact, what you say is kind of alarming. You mentioned these sort of fathers' rights activists from way back, as far back you've been doing your work and being more knowledgeable about it. But to hear that there's not that many folks out there today is actually worrisome, because I often wonder when I'm in this space and I'm like, when am I going to come into some folks that do know a lot more about this? And it's very rare. I mean, there's you, and off the top of my head, I really can't think of that many people that are too familiar with it, especially as far as the history of the program goes, the impact of the program, and not just like maybe an attorney who works in family law, but someone who understands, the welfare program, the child support program, how these interface with, the American family, how this has affected things like, even if you look at parental rights, constitutional protections, and these kinds of things. So I'll say that kind of scares me a little bit there, that we've seemed to have regressed when it comes to knowledge about this stuff.
Well, just to give you a little brief bibliography, there really isn't a lot written. I first wrote about it in my book in 2007, Taken into Custody. And there's references in there there's a whole chapter on child support, and another chapter on domestic violence, another chapter on custody, another chapter on constitutional rights, and it's full of references. But just specifically on child support, we don't have to just talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
But, there was a book a few years ago edited by Barry Comenor. Excellent book, the Law and Economics of Child Support, something or other. Very good book, very scholarly. And a number of the writers in there are very good. Mark Rogers was an economist at the Georgia Federal Reserve, and he was an expert. He died a few years ago, unfortunately. But if anyone wants to Google the name Mark Rogers, Georgia Federal Reserve, you'd find a lot of good stuff. Don Bienovich, and an attorney in Washington named Ron Henry, has published a number of good pieces. So there is some good literature out there, but you got to dig for it.
Yeah, yeah. Even and there is, I'd say there's plenty of studies and academic journals that you can find too that at least detail some of the history. Some of it's kind of couched in sort of the standard propaganda you'd expect,
Exactly.
but
Yes.
even when I was working, at the agency, you didn't see a lot of that, and it wasn't until after that frankly, I had more time to be able to dig into more of the why in the how instead of the sort of just what is, and this is how the program is supposed to run. So there's been a lot of folks, I guess, over the years, detailing this or doing some kind of good work. And, I think when it comes to the average person that's watching this, they might look at us and they might not understand, I guess, what is bad about the system or what needs to change. Because, you see, like, if you think of like child support, for instance, or administration of children and families, it sounds like something that's not really political. It sounds like something that's just kind of there and
Yeah.
basically a good thing, right? So maybe we can speak to a little bit about maybe what you see are some of the issues and maybe what you think should be changed or what you would do differently, especially if you're appointed head of, let's say, of ACF. If RFK reached out to you and said, "Would you like to take that position?" What would you do differently, and what impacts would you like to see from those changes?
Right. Well, first, maybe we should tell listeners a little bit about what these agencies do,
Oh,
what they
that's a
are,
great idea.
because I think a lot of people simply don't know.
Yeah, why don't you start with ACF, Administration of Children and Families, and then I'll tackle OCSS after, and then we can talk about changes after that. I like that.
Good idea. Well, the umbrella group, the highest up group, is the Administration for Children and Families, which is ACF, and that the director of that is a sub cabinet level assistant secretary, requires Senate confirmation. So it's a pretty important position. And it handles basically all of the federal government's policies dealing with formally with children. That is, and the three big ones that it deals with, I think the most important ones are welfare. It's the main, well, they are the federal agency that handles welfare.
Hmm.
And that's in many ways where all of this started, was under welfare with low income families.
Hmm.
And below that are two agencies that are very important. One, as you say, two issues and agencies that correspond with them. One is the Office of Child Support Services, which handles child support, obviously. The
Hmm.
other one is the Children's Bureau, and they handle child abuse.
Okay.
So, but I haven't been able to find up-to-date information on them. Their website doesn't seem to be working. I can't figure out who the current director is. So basically, those are the three, I think, most important things is welfare, which is where a lot of the chicanery of the custody and divorce system started. It's where the child support system was first created. It's where the child abuse machinery was first created, and it's where the domestic violence matters um, were also created
Hmm.
to apply to low income single mother families under the welfare system. So there's a lot of very important things connected of importance for fathers, parents, children, and others who care about these issues. So the umbrella group is the ACF, Administration for Children and Families. And then below that is the Children's Bureau, which handles child support. And that's, sorry, child abuse.
Hmm.
And that's worth saying a few words about, because child abuse, years ago, child abuse was also used in divorce systems as a source of patently false accusations, primarily against fathers, in order to get custody of children.
Hmm.
Now, over the years, child abuse has been used much less in divorce cases, and the emphasis, the favorite weapon now is domestic violence accusations. But child abuse is also important because accusations, false or exaggerated or spurious or politicized charges of child abuse, are leveled not only against divorcing fathers, divorcing parents, but also against intact families. It's used, and there's a good literature on this, a good literature of people who have pointed out how many how precarious parental rights are, even in intact families. How easily you can lose your children to the child welfare system that handles child abuse, and you can lose it for for corporal punishment, for spanking. You could lose it for uh, uh, homeschooling, educational neglect,
Oh,
as they
wow.
call it. Homeschooling, you can lose your children, or you can lose it for obviously if you really abuse your children. And there's one other area that I've slipping my mind now. But anyway, so these accusations, these greatly, oh, you can lose them. Some people have lost their children for raising them as Christians. So, and most
Wow.
recently, the most recent scandal has been involved parents who have testified at school board meetings because they objected to the sexualization of their children, putting their children through transgender,
I
gender
see.
sex changes and things like that,
Yeah.
and they get a visit from the child abuse social workers for that. So it's very politicized. But there are, but it's gotten more attention because the victims, and they are victims, are primarily intact families. But you can also, people in divorce cases get it. One of the things that happens, I've seen this a lot, and I addressed a conference like this, and I suspected this was happening. And when I mentioned it, I got a thunderous applause. So I figured out my suspicion was confirmed. Mothers will use domestic violence accusations to get custody of the children,
Hmm.
and to get to win over to get the father thrown out of the house and to get custody of the children, and then they get to live as single mothers. But then they will get a visit from the child protective services for child abuse, or for various things, which may be completely unfounded and ungrounded.
Yep.
It may be true, because child abuse does take place more than anywhere else in single parent homes. But it may or may not be justified. But the point is, they use the social workers to engineer the removal of their child's father, and then they find that the weapon they've used is turned on them. It's like germ warfare, and
Yeah.
um, and they complain about it, and they get sympathy from some conservatives for this. But in some ways they don't deserve the sympathy, because they're hoist with their own petard. So anyway, we could talk
Yeah.
I think a greater length about child abuse. I think it's an issue that merits discussion. I talked about it in my earlier book, Taken into Custody. But then the third area, the other area that's worth talking about is domestic violence accusations. Now, there's a lot of people talking about that, and that does not fall under ACF or any of its sub-agencies. That tends to be handled by the Justice Department.
Yeah.
So, but
Sorry, I was
but
gonna say, you brought up a lot of great points there, and especially of these organizations being kind of very much wrapped in or outcroppings of the welfare system. And one of my sort of biggest pet peeves, I'm going to get into describing OCSS here in a second, but is this kind of sort of barging in of a public family law welfare system into a private family law system. So what I do not like is that middle class American families who are working hard and doing everything they're supposed to do, being good citizens, being taxpayers and working and being above the table and not doing anything untoward, our actually have become victims of this monstrosity of a public family law system. So a long time ago, public family law, which was only for welfare, families that were on welfare, was separated. There was a wall between that and private family law. And when we get into the creation of the federal child support system, this is how we get the office of OCSS. But in 1975, you started seeing, Congress started taking note of ballooning out of wedlock birth rates and single mother households living off of welfare. And it's not being caused by, a father dying in a war or something like that, but more so just from people who didn't want to stay together. They created Congress passed the Child Support, Enforcement Act in 1975, and this created a federal child support system. And all of this is attached to welfare grants and welfare monies. And even though all the states have the power to do what they want to do, the federal government basically bribes them into doing what the federal government wants to do by offering them welfare monies or using a carrot stick approach. Like, hey, listen, you can get this welfare grant to use and distribute out in your state, but you got to do child support and family law this way. So the OCSS in particular, the Office of Child Support Services, formerly known as Office of Child Support Enforcement, is very much in charge of overseeing all the different state programs for child support. So all the different state programs have to be in line with federal expectations and federal guidelines and federal laws. And they have to communicate and be audited by OCSS. And based off of their performance and how OCSS judges them to have performed, welfare grants and different grants are given out to the states. Different incentive payments might be given out to the states. Before the 90s, I believe, when child support enforcement was created in 75, it was supposed to just be for welfare families. That's all they were concerned with. So people who are on welfare, child support as a federal program was concerned with recouping that money for the taxpayer. But then what they started doing was giving incentive payments to the states to say, hey, why don't you guys start advertising your services and taking on non-welfare cases? So states would receive incentive payments to do that. And this, to me, represented this kind of public family law encroaching into the realm of private family law. And it has really become this kind of carrot stick approach where it's kind of bullied states into changing their family law codes to match essentially what the federal government wants them to do. And it's really expanded the welfare state. So when you look at OCSS, what they'll say is their kind of main, I guess, goal here is to ensure that, child support or paternity is established for these kids out of wedlock. Child support orders are created for them. Child support orders are enforced. They're collected. Back pay is collected. And then also, trying to do this at an efficient cost, basically. So those will be like what's called performance measures, and that's written into the Title 4D code of the Social Security Act. And the OCSS is designed to encourage states and help states meet those performance goals. And based off of those performance measures is how money's divvied out to the states. So the states have this incentive of basically really, I guess, buttressing the welfare state, encouraging the welfare state, encroaching into the private lives of families and having and incentivizing these options here. And I think all of this stuff has really created a huge barrier and issue for things like fatherhood. So we have a kind of crisis of fatherhood in the United States. And what you have is this robust child support enforcement program, which we know has damaged families. I mean, we have research papers on this. We have there's a paper from 2007, which is about questioning child support for poor families. And at the end of the paper, it pretty much explicitly says that compared to families where the federal child support system is not allowed, was not, excuse me, not allowed, but was not involved, the father was more involved in the child's life. But after the child support enforcement system got involved, it literally pushes the father away from the child with these, financial requirements that the father can't meet and all these kinds of things. Then on the other end, you have custody, which is still firmly rooted in private family law and isn't funded by the taxpayer. So fathers are getting grinded down by a child support system that oftentimes asks too much or has harsh enforcement measures. And then on the other end, they're really not able to fight for custody because they have no money left over to do so. So OCSS, again, is this federal office which is in charge of making sure all the state child support programs are in compliance with federal guidelines. If you take California, for instance, just to give you an example, before 1975, child support and things like that went through the criminal code, basically. Went through criminal court. You had, I think it was Penal Code 270, which basically stated, like parents had an obligation to support their kids, so they would use that to go after parents and establish child support orders. After 75, once the federal program was created, then federal money starts coming in and you get this new sort of child support program, which is outside of criminal court, and it's, within family support court and all that kind of stuff. And so just to give folks an idea, I know I was a kind of a long-winded there, but OCSS has a lot of power in how states go about creating and enforcing child support in their states.
Before we go further, let me just underline a couple things you said and emphasize a couple of the broad principles, just so people know where some of the implications of all this. First of all, there is no federal authorization. There's no constitutional authorization for any of this. As you say, the federal government dominates, manipulates, entices the states to do what it wants. But there's no constitutional mandate or authorization for the federal government to be involved in family policy at all in any way. And that goes for child support enforcement, it goes for domestic violence, and it goes for child abuse. So in all three of these areas, the federal government is involving itself in what are supposed to be state matters. The other thing that's maybe worth emphasizing here is what this does to social workers. I used to wonder why people hate social workers. I thought social workers seemed like nice people to me. They take care of the poor. They don't make a lot of money. They sacrifice. They go out and work among the poor and they help them. How come everybody hates them so much? And I realize now why everybody hates them so much. What these programs do, all of them, child support enforcement, domestic violence, child abuse, they turn social workers into plainclothes police. It's essentially a police function. They are, but they're not police. They're not limited the way we limit, uniformed policemen with certain constraints because of people's constitutional rights and the rights of suspects and the accused. No, they're plainclothes police who operate largely free of constitutional protections and limitations. So this is very, I think, extremely improper, especially when you consider that the social work profession over the decades, from the very beginning, it was professional social work was founded by ideologues, by women for the most part, who were sympathetic to communism, anarchism, and feminism. Women like Jane Addams and others. And they took over. Charity, poor relief charity, had been conducted by volunteer women, Christian women, organized by churches, subsidized by their husbands. And they were replaced by, and they had no incentive to perpetuate poverty. Their incentive was to solve the problem. And they inculcated Christian morality. They didn't tolerate out of wedlock sex, out of wedlock births, because they knew that, bastards, as they call them, illegitimate children, was the source of poverty. So they did their best to end it. They were replaced, when social work was professionalized, they were replaced by paid professional social workers who had the opposite incentive. They had an incentive to perpetuate the problem they were supposed to be solving. And that's precisely what they did. First of all, the welfare payments themselves were an incentive to create single mother homes, to throw out the father, or at least keep him hidden and tucked away somewhere, and to create single mother homes. And then the child abuse and domestic violence and child support systems reinforced this for single motherhood and entrenched it even further and made it intractable. And when you consider on top of that, so these social workers had a bureaucratic interest in perpetuating the problem they were supposed to be solving. And on top of that, increasingly from the very beginning, and increasingly over the decades, they were immersed in radical ideology, and especially feminism, which didn't like men to begin with. So not only did they have a bureaucratic and financial incentive to marginalize the fathers, they had an ideological incentive to do this as well. And this is, so increasingly you've got these ideological, professional feminists, basically what they are, in charge of the nation's families, and acting as plainclothes police, and increasingly criminalizing the fathers with accusations of child abuse, or criminalizing intact families, or Christians, or heterosexuals, with accusations of child abuse, accusations of domestic violence, and accusations of non-payment of child support. So, this turning social workers into police has been very, very dangerous. I believe it's the origins of what people now call the deep state. I don't think the origins of the deep state are in the FBI or the CIA or the Office of Homeland Security. I think they're in the welfare state, because this is when social workers first took control. Federal government functionaries, bureaucrats, first took control of people's private lives and the private lives of the poor. And as you say, all three of these areas, child abuse, child domestic violence, and child support, all these expanded to include middle class from poor families, poor households to middle class families, which expanded the system hugely, simply quantitatively in terms of the number of parents and families that fell under their jurisdiction. But also, it expanded the system in a lucrative way because, at least in child support, they were able to they could go after middle class fathers who had deeper pockets to mine. Then, previously the system had been designed for, 20-year-old low income men, impecunious men in the ghettos making, maybe 15, 20,000 a year.
You bring a great point there. Sorry to interrupt you, but
No, please do.
I can tell you, just as someone who's worked child support cases, as an actual case worker, everybody who works cases in child support knows that the hardest cases to collect money on are welfare cases. You know what I mean? If it's a regular non-welfare case, oftentimes you don't even have to do anything. Just the wage assignment goes to their above the table job, and the money comes in. You don't even have to look at the case. It's very rare that you got to do that. What
Exactly.
A lot of the hard work comes in from trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip. And here's the part about the child support program that really gets on my nerves. If you look at, let's say, even if you look at the OCSS Wikipedia, what they'll do is they'll say, we collected this many
Yeah.
millions of dollars in child support, and most of that money got sent home. And that's supposed to sound like an accomplishment. But actually, it's really just it's just a cover-up of their massive failure, because their original mission is to recoup this money expended on welfare. But if you look at the welfare cases versus the non-welfare cases, they're barely able to collect money on welfare cases. But what they do is they attack middle-class families, and then the money that they get from those people, they say, look how good of a job we're doing. We collected
Right.
all this money. But what people don't understand is that most of that money has nothing to do with the welfare money that's went out in the first place. So
Let me,
it's just this big lie, and
yeah.
it's what annoys me so much, and people don't understand that. That mixed with the fact that hardworking middle class families are subject to the tyranny of this sort of welfare lawfare, I guess you'd call it. And a lot of people don't realize it. It's a huge issue, and it's destroying families. But please, I know you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of I found this when I first read about it, difficult to wrap my mind around. So I want to try and just restate this in a different way to make it clear what's going on. In other words, the system does not serve the people it was created for, the low income families who are living on welfare and
Hmm.
trying to recover tax dollars. It doesn't serve them. It preys upon people who it was never intended to serve, middle class
Exactly.
families. In other
Exactly.
words, in in the old days, when a couple was divorced, the parents were divorced, the father, presumably, would send a check to the mother. That's
Yeah.
all. He just sent a check to the mother, and sometimes he did it voluntarily without a court order. He just took it. If the divorce was amicable, he just sent it. What the federal child support people are doing now is they're routing that check, which would have gone through the mail from the father to the mother. They're taking that money, routing it through their own system,
It goes to the
and
state
saying, "Look at
disbursement unit, gets
yeah,
reported to
look
OCSS.
exactly. Look at this money we collected. This father. And they even call them deadbeat dads.
Yeah.
It was Donna Shalala, the former. Was it Donna Shalala? She was the former HHS secretary, or was she housing? Anyway, and she said we took this money from this deadbeat dad. It's like, you know, all they're doing is taking the check that the middle class fathers voluntarily paid,
Yeah.
and they're routing it through their accounting system, and they're saying, look at this check which our enforcement officers collected, which otherwise to help these starving, neglected, abandoned children. What can you
Exactly.
say?
It,
It's a complete lie.
it's a farce. It's a farce. And again, you mentioned this kind of hijacking of the poor relief system by these kind of bureaucratic radical ideologues. And it's the same thing just happens in child support also. You know what I mean? Like, well, in welfare. Like, let me tell you about welfare. Historically in welfare, it was meant for mothers and children who had either been abandoned or their husbands had been lost and passed away, or what they were made widows and this kind of thing. And what they would do is, like, if mom was living with her new boyfriend and there was another male in the house, if the welfare caseworker, somebody can call into the welfare office and say, "Hey, I saw that." They would do they would do a check, they'd send somebody out, and if they found that was the case, they would cut off the welfare funds because they'd say, "Hey, you're living with someone, with another man. He should be providing." Like that, they would go with that, but basically it's like, okay, you're divorced. You have children with this guy. You guys don't want to live together. You want to live with your new boyfriend. We're not going to give you welfare. We're not going to subsidize that life for you. Then what happens, kind of in the same way, as probably around the same time as this kind of invasion by these radical ideologues, is what they did is they took welfare and they made it a matter of civil rights. And then you had some landmark cases. I wish I could remember them off the top of my head, but I think they went up to the Supreme Court, and it was about, it essentially transformed this sort of poor relief program that you said was once governed by these different morals and values, specifically Christian morals and values. And it made it a matter of civil rights. So what happened was the welfare rolls went up dramatically because all these other people who wouldn't receive them otherwise, maybe they're living with new boyfriend or whatever, could now go back and apply for welfare and get the money. You know what I mean? And it was more about mom and the children, and it wasn't about families altogether and looking at them holistically. So it's interesting when you watch the sort of change over of how this goes from something originally really more focused on the impoverished class and trying to get them out of poverty or to help them and that had these kind of strict rules about it, into this kind of entitlement program, I guess you'd call it, and just expand and really move away from the original intention of what it was supposed to be the whole time.
Yes, absolutely. And what I found, just to push the story a little further, I think what happened basically was the welfare system became really politicized, especially in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And what was happening was before there used to be a robust debate in the United States all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, the times I was growing up. There was a robust debate, some very fine intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, even the hated neocons were some of them. And they were, between left and right, because everyone thought that welfare was bad. Everybody thought that welfare was demeaning and, the second best option. Conservatives didn't like it because it was wasteful and full of spongers. And even liberals didn't like it because, they thought people should have the dignity of jobs. And even the
Mm-hmm.
Marxists didn't like it because even the Marxists said, no, the welfare just buys off the poor and prevents the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody hated welfare. And everybody says robust debate, 60s, 70s, 80s, how to get rid of it. Well, what happened? Why is that debate ended? We didn't get rid of it, by the way. So what happened? Why is there no longer this robust, this highbrow debate about how to get rid of it? I'm talking about great intellectuals like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and
Mm-hmm.
Charles Murray and some of these political scientists like what's his name, James Wilson. What happened? Why did this all dry up? I'll tell you what happened. In the 90s, the system got financially just unbearable. Something had to be done to relieve. So Clinton came along. Bill Clinton came along, and he said, the third way. He was the right wing Democrat. He was going to, he wanted welfare reform. The liberals were nervous, but he was going to do it, and the conservatives loved him because he was going
Mm-hmm.
to reform welfare. What did he do? He didn't reform welfare. What he did reduce the rolls modestly a bit, and I think I'm told all those modest cuts in welfare rolls were restored by Obama
Mm-hmm.
later on. So it really didn't do anything. But what the welfare reform bill of '96 did was it strengthened the child support system. And
Yes.
what it did was it further pushed the social workers into police functions. And so the feminists discovered that, well, the welfare system was not, demeaning after all. And it also wasn't about relieving the poor. It was about empowering women. The welfare system became a way of empowering women, primarily social workers, but they could also say empowering the single mothers, empowering all these women.
Yeah.
So welfare went from being a necessary evil for everybody to being a positive good for these radical feminist women. And Clinton engineered this. Clinton facilitated this, I should say. And that's in the 90s when we started hearing about the hysteria about deadbeat dads,
Hmm.
and the media started going after them, and there was all this horror
Yep.
about, fathers abandoning their children and the need to twist a knife on them, and the media became hysterical and the government became hysterical, and this was where all this it came from. It was all, again, it was
I
completely dishonest.
I like that
Completely
you
dishonest.
you compare it to a kind of police function. It in the mid '90s, essentially AFDC, Aid to Families and Dependent Children. That was the welfare
Yeah,
program
that's
before
right.
it got changed to TANF, which is Temporary Aid to Needy Families, and that's what Perora, otherwise known as welfare reform, that was the
That's
uh,
the one.
personal work responsibility and work opportunity I always forget the name of it.
Yes, so do I. It's
But
just common
what
name.
that did and what they were arguing in Congress at that time was to put teeth and give power to the child support system. And it was argued that they wanted it to be as robust and powerful as the IRS system. So someone named Marilyn Ray Smith, who was addressing Congress when they were trying to pass this, she used to be, I think, a director of an agency. I can't remember. I think it was on the East Coast. I think it was Delaware or something like that. But she wanted it to be as powerful as the IRS system. And what this did was this created a system of big data, And this is
Yeah,
what made
huge.
OCSS so important was that OCSS helps to manage some of these huge data systems, specifically like Federal Parent Locator Service, National. There's a database, a new hire database, and facilitate all these kinds of things. So it went from being child support before the federal program went from being something that was in criminal court in which people can bring a complaint and they would look at it, and the courts had dexterity. The states handled this how they found they were going to handle it, however they saw fit, and the judges had more dexterity, I think, to look at a situation and make a judgment call on that. Then the federal program comes in and it basically wrestles that away from criminal court into family court, and it says, hey, we need you guys to standardize your laws this way. So now if you're a judge, you're like, well, I got to look at the guideline calculator first. I can deviate it, but it's not as easy to deviate from it. So most people end up with these kind of cookie cutter things. But
By the way, excuse me, I can't help but interject here. Well, everything you just said lends evidence to my thesis
yeah,
that this is the origin of the deep state.
it,
You
it,
know, this is not the FBI, not the CIA, not Homeland Security. This is where it came from. Those databases that you talk about, those tracking services. I mean, I go into that in my book, Taken into
mm,
Custody, and it's just Orwellian.
yeah.
So sorry, go on. I
Oh,
just couldn't
I
help.
can read to you what. So Perora, this is just for my notes here, but in Perora, uh, what it expanded access and gave access to child support agency was vital stats, state and local tax and revenue records, records of real and titled personal property, records of occupational and professional licenses for medical to bar, even to fishing licenses,
Yeah,
records concerning
hunting
ownership and
license.
control of corporations, partnerships, and other business entities, employment security records, records of agencies administering public assistance, DMV and law enforcement records, correction records, military locate system, the credit history records, public utilities and television companies, also internet service providers now, assets and liabilities from information provided by financial institutions. That's your banking system. So they have their tentacles everywhere. Financial institutions doing business in the
Yeah.
state must provide
Oh yeah.
name, social security number, and address of anyone owing delinquent support and cooperate in levying funds. Once child support agency confirms the amounts owed, liens allow states to administratively place liens on obligor assets and also allows for interstate liens without judicial process required. So, I mean, this system is so robust and has its tentacles and everything. Just me as a caseworker, when I would sit at my desk and I look at my screen and I click on someone's profile, the amount of information I had on a single person just by plugging in their social security number was just unreal. I mean, we'd see all past addresses, past jobs, quarterly incomes, IRS statements. I mean, it would banks again because we would do levies, liens. I mean, if we found out somebody's parents owned a house, not that they owned a
Yeah.
house, somebody's parents owned a house, we would send a lien over there just for when they passed away, we can get something through probate court. It's just, it was so expansive, and just, it is really amazing where it's moved to. And all of this is kind of bought and paid for by these kind of welfare grants. And it really is the expansion of the welfare state. It really is the sort of subversion of the American family proper under the thumb of this, what I call an abomination of a system. And you would, what you mentioned as the deep state, people probably think of that as like, oh, these kind of high up level stuff that affects politicians up there. But it really is also the penetration of the government into the private lives of families. That is the deep state.
Because it started with the poor, because the poor are vulnerable. Poor people don't have the, generally the defenses, the education, the means, the leisure time to defend their rights, to defend their privacy. So the wedge was inserted there with the poor population. But then it gradually, once the leverage was in place, it was expanded into the middle class where there were deeper pockets. So, I maintain that the American welfare system is often looked, by comparison with Europe, is often said to be quite minimalist because it's limited to the poor. But that was exactly what was, in some ways, so diabolical about it, was that it inserted its tentacles into the poor population who couldn't fight back, and then from there, once the machinery was in place, it just expanded into the middle class, and the middle class didn't know what hit them,
Yeah,
because they weren't paying attention. I mean, who spends their time looking at the welfare system? It's a dreary, it's a dreary world.
yeah.
Nobody spends their time examining
Or child support. Like, I mean, people
Yeah.
just think it's, oh, taking care of your kids, and they associate that with this common sense idea of parents taking care of their kids. They don't understand how complex of a system this is, how many layers there is to it, what they can do. I mean, even before, when I applied there, I didn't even know what I was applying for. I was like, oh, child support, okay, this seems like a okay job for someone who's out of school now. Like, let me give that a shot. And then I started working there, and I'm like, oh, that's what this is. That's how this works. Oh, you can pay child support for a kid that's not yours. And a lot of that, again, is influenced, I would argue, is influenced by the federal government, because state agency, county agencies, and then state agencies, which, umbrella those, are focused on performance measures, which are written into Title 4D. One of those performance measures is paternity establishment. They don't care who the father is. They care about saying, we have a father on paper for this kid. So you can come there with your genetic test later on, and they're going to say, well, there's not much we can do about that, but you do have to pay. Then when they go to the federal government, OCSS later, they can say, look how well we did on our performance measures. We would have whole meetings for this back when I worked at the agency, and that's the entire agency is focused on increasing these performance measures. So however they can do that, they will do, and then they go back and say, please give us more, matching funds, on the other end. Look how good we did this year. And again, it just bothers me because, especially now in California, they've been doing changes where they've been doing these kind of pass-throughs where, you'd have money that's owed to the state, and then sometimes they would do a compromise program with the debtor in order to recoup some funds for the state, and they might forgive some of it. Now what they're doing, through the direction of Newsom, and also encouraged, I would say, by OCSS, is what they will say is they're trying to help poor families by letting more money come to them. So what they'll say is any collections they get, instead of paying it back to the state, which it's rightfully owed, the taxpayer, they're going to pass that forward to mom. So mom collects welfare and mom collects back pay on these monies that's owed to the state. And a lot of that has changed. They've made some changes in foster care. And what I've seen from that is they're still hard on the middle class with the welfare system that was never designed for them and that they never asked for. And now they're starting to say, well, since we can't collect monies from most of these welfare cases, we're going to try to be less tough on them, basically. And that's supposed to help families, which is really just giving more money to broken families, to mom, and on that side. But really all I'm seeing is sort of this kind of socialism being snuck through the back door. So it's all in the guise of helping families. they can't really overtly do this because people will say, why are you doing this? So they're doing it through the child support system to, on the one hand, here's welfare. On the other hand, here's the money, here's the wealth transfer, here's the subsidized welfare from dad that we're going in, and we're going to just pass that through you also. In a lot of these cases, especially money that's supposed to be owed back to the welfare system. So there's these things I'm seeing, and I feel like they're using California as a petri dish, but that's another matter. But when it comes to OCSS, all of this kind of stuff is encouraged by OCSS. Yeah. OCSS is supposed to be watching for these kinds of things and saying, hey, no, this isn't in the spirit of what the program is supposed to be for.
Right, right. And touching on something you said a few minutes ago about how the Welfare Reform Act was brought in '96, it was really, and it still is to this day, in many ways, used the term socialism, which it is in many ways, but it's also a collusion between the radical feminists and the conservatives. The latter, I'm not sure I understand what's going on, but it gave the social workers, the feminist social workers, these police powers. And the conservatives were told that this was saving money. This was, it was money that was, not being paid out for welfare anymore. So this was fiscal responsibility. So this collusion between the feminists and the social workers, the feminists and the conservatives, to screw the fathers, and to save money in doing so, supposedly, which it didn't do, by the way, but it's another matter. Who was left out of all this? Well, the old liberals were left by the wayside. The old liberals who naively thought that the welfare system was about relieving the poor. We can forget it then. And the other people that were left out, of course, are the poor.
Yeah.
Because you never notice how you never hear anything anymore about poverty or relieving poverty or taking care of the poor. Nobody cares about that. The left, for years, that was the left's main claim to legitimacy, was that they're supposed to be looking out for the poor and the working class. But you don't hear this anymore. You just hear about how it's all empowering women and saving money, empowering women on the feminist left and saving money on the conservative right. And they're the only ones that matter. And the old liberals and the poor themselves are the ones that are left out in the cold. And nobody cares about them anymore.
Yeah.
So it's,
It has all. Sorry to interrupt you. It has all become this very short-term thinking. Empowering women. And I think a lot of the mid '90s welfare reform was sold as that way, because what they did is they put a stop on how much the children could still receive it so long as they're minors. But it was supposed to be this great cost-saving measure, because after a couple years, they would have these programs that were supposed to be designed to help mom get back to work and all these kinds of things. And they really encouraged this kind of, we got to get the women working also. So it seemed like this win where it's like, we're going to pay less welfare. We're going to get the women working. We're going to collect money from these quote unquote deadbeat dads. But now we're in this situation where it's, families are really struggling to stay together, let alone be created. And the birth rate is what it is. We hear Elon Musk tweeting about that once a week. And we've kind of put ourselves in this position where we've stopped thinking holistically about the health of families, unfortunately. And, it's all couched in this propaganda about creating a bridge between families, and we're just trying to help families, but they don't really tell you what they mean by that. Like, are they trying to help out a traditional style family, or are they trying to help out a broken family? And all these kinds of things. Right. And then when you look at when these systems were created, they even didn't have a lot of studies available to them at that time. And then as they start doing more studies more recently, they find out things like, hey, child support enforcement actually harms poor families. Every time, whenever it's involved, the children end up getting less money from their father and having less of a relationship with their father than they otherwise would have. So, okay, then they realize that. Now what they're trying to do is say, okay, well, we've basically destroyed families for the last 50 years or however long it's been. Let's try to do these pass-throughs and see if we can get more money over to the kids and make it a little easier on these poor families. Instead of at the same time, looking at what they're doing to the middle class, which is frankly just, I would even argue, creating more and more impoverished families by breaking them up. So it's entirely backwards. It's entirely backwards.
No, that's worth emphasizing. That this child support, like welfare before it, is a subsidy on divorce and broken families. And where you get a subsidy, you're going to get more of it. It's a positive incentive for mothers to divorce. That's a whole nother story. I think we could spend a whole hour on that, so I won't get
Yeah.
into it. But no, it's a definite incentive, and it creates more divorce and more broken families. So all these policies that you've been discussing, they all presuppose a broken family.
Hmm.
They don't step back for a moment and say, well, why are the families broken in the first place? Well, can we prevent the families being broken,
Yeah.
so we don't have to do all this? No, that's out of the question. That's not permitted. The discussion is not permitted to go there, because you realize that the system itself is what is creating these broken families. It is destroying them. And another thing that, by the way, I didn't mention this, but another thing that ACF does
Hmm.
is they are the ones that presided over these fatherhood programs and marriage programs of the Clinton and Bush administrations. Again, I'll talk about this very briefly because we could spend I think we could spend a whole show on this.
Sure.
But in the 90s, under the Clintons, under Al Gore, actually, the whole system was becoming insane. Um, Not only was the welfare system insolvent, but it was becoming conspicuous. The fatherhood crisis was getting worse and worse. And so Al Gore started this fatherhood program, and Clinton sponsored it. And we're going to reconnect fathers with their children and teach good fathering and all. Nobody explained how the federal government was going to teach men to be good fathers, or what this was, how the what could the federal government do
Yeah.
to uh, to teach men how to be good fathers, and other than stop subsidizing divorce, but other than paying their wives to divorce them. And then the same programs were relabeled under the conservative Bush administration. The same programs were relabeled as marriage promotion programs. And here too, nobody explained how the federal government was going to encourage marriage or teach marriage skills or relationship skills and all this. Well, if you look at these programs, whether that was the left-wing version under Clinton or the right-wing version under Bush, they were about collecting child support.
I was just
They
gonna. I was sorry. Please finish your thought. I don't want to
they were
interrupt you.
they were deputizing. Well, you probably know more about it than I do, but they were deputizing private groups, including, as the Bushes used to say, faith-based organizations, to collect child support. In other words, they were deputizing the right-wing pro-family conservative groups, and I don't know how many really were involved,
Mm.
this much, but to collect to develop an incentive to have more broken families so they could collect more child support.
Yeah.
But you know more about this than I do, I'm
And then
sure.
that puts the numbers up. That puts the performance measures up. The thing, when you talk about a government saying, encouraging someone to be a good father, all I hear is them saying, we just want you to be a better cash cow that we can take money from.
Exactly.
Has nothing to do with the relationship and encouraging this relationship and facilitating this relationship between father and children, which is what's ultimately lacking on so many levels from our society. So,
Right.
even OCSS, you mentioned ACF, but OCSS does the same thing. I mean, they'll provide funding to different child support programs across the nation in order to facilitate these fatherhood programs or these
Yeah.
employment programs. And it's all about really just trying to get these people to basically to work so that they can then pay their child support debts that they owe. It's focused on that more so. They might say a thing here or there. Oh, I mean, but it's not custody. It's not about putting the family back together. To them, a complete family isn't the mom, dad, and the children. It's mom, the
No.
state, dad over here, and then the children here with mom and the state. That to
Yeah.
them is helping a family.
Right.
And
And but just a couple of years ago, Ron DeSantis in Florida resurrected these same programs.
mm.
They didn't work in the 90s, they didn't work in the 2000s, and yet Ron DeSantis is dredging them up again and trying to implement them in Florida.
Yeah,
It's just
it's lip service, and it's just like you say. There is a long history of them trying to do these programs and them failing, if not making the situation worse.
yeah,
Whether they be these kind of tongue-in-cheek, I guess, outreach programs from the agency or bigger ones, coming from OCSS. I guess that kind of brings us to maybe we can kind of round out the discussion with this.
yeah.
But maybe what changes we'd like to see or what impact, especially if RFK Jr. appointed you the head, of ACF and say I was commissioner tomorrow for OCSS, what changes I'd like to see, and here's at least the challenging part for OCSS. I'll start off is OCSS essentially is beholden to what's written in Title 4D. And what's written in Title 4D are these performance measures. So that's what they care about. And OCSS is supposed to help facilitate, you know, states to match, you know, what paternity establishment, child support order establishment, child support collections, these kinds of things. So that's what they do. But there is this other room in OCSS for other things that they do in terms of funding research, funding other programs that can ostensibly help out with fatherhood. I think, you know, I would like to make OCSS more about focusing on fathers and restoring the father relationship with children, and putting block grants and money into programs that actually do that. Even if it's just outright funding fathers to pay for private family custody hearings in order to get back in their lives. But they have such a disincentive to do this, because the minute the father starts getting more custody, the less the child support order is. That's going to affect the performance and these kinds of things. But ultimately, I think a policy of diminishment is what's in order, because if OCS's hands are tied, then if they can at least minimize their sort of impact on what they're doing and send money to proper research on facilitating fatherhood, I think that would at least be a win. I mean, if it comes to at least trying to be less invasive. So that's where my struggle is with that.
Yeah, I would say, and I'll just be very brief because, again, maybe we could elaborate on another occasion.
Yeah.
But I would say the biggest challenge, I think the basic principle, and this is a well-known principle in administrative policy and law, is the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, first, do no harm. I think that's the thing. The minimal government policy to achieve your aims should be presumed to be the best. And in this case, you know, the government's, we got to make sure that the child support, all of these systems, the whole family policy machinery is not doing more harm than good, which I think it is now. I think the biggest challenge, and I think the starting point should be to make this system consistent with the Constitution.
Yeah.
The Constitution has to be our baseline. It has to be our guideline. And so much of the family policy is flagrantly unconstitutional. I mean, the very involvement of the federal government in families at all has no constitutional justification. So, you know, it needs to be, we need to respect the Bill of Rights. We need to respect the contract clause of the Constitution. We need to respect people's rights of privacy, habeas corpus, and so forth. And that, you know, all of these family policy machinery is violated on a daily basis, as I outlined in my book, Taken into Custody. So that's where I would start off at ACS. ACF is to go down and scrutinize all the policies and their effects, not just their intentions but their actual consequences, and are they and in conjunction with other government policies. For example, the child support system. There's no justification for confiscating people's income or attaching their wages or taking their property in order to provide for their children, unless there's some reason to believe that they're failed to provide for their children in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, you have to. You know, what is there? There's no finding of fact in the vast majority of cases, or in any case, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So I think that's the kind of thing that we need to scrutinize these policies and their consequences for, and make sure they're not violating the Constitution and doing more harm than good.
Yeah, and the other sort of scrutiny there too, I think, especially on child support agencies, is emphasizing the fact and auditing them for how much money is being. I mean, they do keep track of these numbers, but I think developing policies around that emphasizes them more so focusing on welfare cases instead of non-welfare cases and being invasive there. If there's a way to at least pull back some of that from non-welfare cases, I think would be good, and to stop giving them credit for collecting money on what I call easy money, versus saying, hey, the stuff you're actually supposed to be doing, you're not doing, and you should be graded based off of that more harshly, I think would need to happen. So there are things that, even though they do exist and, you know, they're bound by these laws, I think within the Trump administration as a whole, there's a lot of changes that could be made, especially if there's more support coming from top down. I mean, if Trump signed an executive order with some of these issues in mind, that would give these offices a lot more power to carry out those orders. And
Absolutely.
that would be fantastic. So, part of
Yeah.
me kind of, just to round this off, I know we're past an hour here, is when I look at maybe Trump or RFK, I think they're probably, I could be wrong, but they would appear largely unaware of the importance of these offices and maybe what power they have to effect some change here in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think so too. I think
So,
so too. And so
hopefully,
a lot of other people are also, and that's not healthy, to have bureaucracies out there operating, and the citizens and the policymakers and the political leaders don't know what they're doing or what they're for, or what they should be doing.
yeah.
And that's very unhealthy in a democracy, and it's why we find ourselves overrun by these this so-called deep state and
Mhm.
these functionaries who are doing things we don't know where they came from, what they're doing, what they're supposed to be doing. Um, these things, and I think Trump suffered, his effectiveness suffered from not facing this stuff in his first term,
Mhm.
and so far he hasn't faced it in this term either. So I think he would benefit a lot by confronting this squarely.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good note to leave it on. Hopefully, maybe this video will reach some ears. Maybe we can pass it around to some folks and it can at least educate some either just the folks out there or maybe even if some of the folks up there, in power see this, maybe they can have a better understanding. So, more to come on this. We'll be watching what they do there and we'll be talking about this soon. So, please, more to come and we'll get you guys more content. Thank you, Dr. Baskerville, for being here with me again.
Thank you. My pleasure.